Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. You are tuned into the art of black and white photography with Sony Artisan of Imagery, Thibault Roland. Thibault, welcome.
Thanks, Derek. I'm really excited to be here today.
It's great to have you back on. It's been a little while. A huge thank you, of course, to Sony for hosting today's event, and
Yes.
a special welcome to everybody joining us on the main B&H Facebook page. Of course, you can check us out there. And if you guys do not already know, we do have a event space YouTube page. If you head over to YouTube and look up the B&H event space, you can watch all of our streaming content live on there, and we will have it archived there as well. I'll remind everybody that if you do have any questions, feel free to get them in. You can just drop it right in the comments section. But Thibault, this is your domain, man. You do such a great job when you come on, and this is your
Thank
expertise.
you.
It seems with the black and white stuff. So I'm gonna kick it over to you, and I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
All right, sounds great. All right, let me share my screen. There we go. Let me know if you can see it. I'm really excited today to talk about one of the techniques, one of the aspects of my photography that I love absolutely the most, which is black and white photography. And to start with this presentation, I really want to thank everyone at Sony, as Derek mentioned, and everyone at B&H for making this event happen. And of course, thank you all for being here today. So today, if my presentation actually behaves, I will discuss a little bit about why you might want to consider black and white photography as one of the options that might actually even improve your photography. I will then switch to another section which has more to do about your own vision as an artist and how it's tied to black and white photography. And I will also talk a little bit about how black and white photography can actually make more, can be more interesting than just plain color photography. The second part of this presentation will be focused more on how to shoot in black and white or to convert to black and white. And then I will share a typical workflow with at least one of my images, possibly two images of mine, depending on how much time we have. And if you have any questions, as Derek mentioned, please put them in the chat. I'll be more than happy to answer all your questions at the end. So first of all, just so you know a little bit more about myself, I'm not from around here. I'm originally from France, although I am right now based in Portland, Oregon. I am a scientist by training. I am also a Sony Artisan of Imagery, and I would define myself as being a fine art photographer, specializing in seascapes, architecture, and landscape photography. About 90% of my work has some kind of flavor of long exposure to it, and about 70% of what I do is black and white. So as you can imagine, this is really something that resonates quite a bit with me, and I am more than happy to talk about it today. Okay, so why would you be interested in black and white in the first place rather than color? Well, there are a number of reasons that typically you might want to convert an image from color to black and white. And the very first reason is because sometimes, and in particular, if you're using filters, but it may just happen to be because of the specific light conditions, the specific weather that you're shooting, or the main elements in the pictures that you're actually capturing. They might, I mean, your picture might end up having some pretty dull colors or have some color cast, in particular in the case of filters. And when that's the case, a really easy way of fixing that is to actually convert your color image to black and white. And that can happen if the color cast is more on the warmer side, like you saw in the previous picture, or more on the colder kind of blue color cast, like you can see in this particular picture here on the left-hand side. It is a pretty good picture, but you know, the very cold hue kind of takes away from the picture at that point. So I decided to convert it to black and white. And in that case, I don't have to worry anymore about, sharing this feeling of coldness to my that would be conveyed in the color image. Also, in particular, when you're using filters, just as a side note, in this particular slide, I was actually using neutral density filters that were a little bit of an older generation. So the quality wasn't quite as high as what you can find these days. As you can see in the upper picture, the outside of the picture is very magenta, while in the center of the picture itself, it's a little bit more grayish, turning a little bit on the green side. Because of this particular non-homogeneous color cast, I decided to basically turn everything to black and white, and now I didn't have to worry about any of that anymore. So why I love black and white photography is because I really consider that this is a technique with which you can actually bring more to your work rather than just keeping it in color. And I'll share with you a few of these reasons why that's the case. So for instance, you're able to tone down distracting elements. If you look on the left-hand side, I have this little shed that's red. And because it's red, the color contrast is really, really strong and it will attract the eye of the person looking at this picture towards the shed and not towards the main element that I want them to look at, which is the lighthouse. After converting it to black and white, now I really toned down the shed. It's not red anymore, obviously. And now there's nothing that's actually really attracting the eye of the person looking at the picture towards anything else but the main element in that picture, which again is the lighthouse. Another really powerful thing about black and white photography is that you're able to really bring out details in your images. In the picture on the left-hand side, you can see how the clouds are making this kind of really cool pattern behind the main element, which is that the steeple of that church that I shot back in France. And it's kind of an interesting pattern that I really wanted to emphasize. But if you're emphasizing it, if you're increasing the contrast in the color picture, if you're saturating the background, you're basically going to saturate the colors as well, and it will not look natural at all. If now you're converting your color image to black and white, because you're stepping away from reality, it's one way already of basically going into this realm of fine art photography um, that is going to be different from what you would be accustomed to seeing in person as you're shooting or as you're walking around down the street. It really helps very nicely with being able to actually now bring out all the details in the background. And as you can tell, I also was able to bring out a lot of the details also in the roof of the steeple itself. So black and white photography is this really, really powerful tool to bring out so many details without running into issues and artifacts that would come up with color images. What another aspect of black and white photography that you may already have noticed in the previous images is how it will allow you to create this vignette effect. Very, very natural. The vignette is basically how is an effect that allows you to darken the outside of the image. It doesn't have to be centered, but it will really allow you to basically create a gradient of tonalities where the highest tonality will be centered toward the main element in the picture. And this is really what you're seeing here on the right-hand side, where because I created this very strong vignette all around the picture, even though that vignette is actually offset to one side because my main subject is offset to one side, it is here to help support my vision and help basically create an image that is easier to read for the people who are looking at it. And now again, the whole idea is that they will have their vision, their eye attracted toward the main subject in the picture, which is in this case this little fishing hut that I captured in France. Another really great way to use black and white photography, and in particular black and white conversion, is that you are able to emphasize some of the details in your picture. If you see on the left-hand side, I have a very, very, very faint um, almost leading line, very smooth gradient line in the sky that is somewhat pointing at the main element in the picture, which is also here, this lighthouse. But it's such a faint line that it's really going to be hard for people looking at the color image to really use it as a way to help navigate the picture and bring the vision, bring their eye toward the main element in the picture. Now, because I converted the picture to black and white and emphasized this particular line, as well as the second line that's a little bit lower, I was able to really emphasize that leading line. And now people are really reading very easily this picture, and you can see how it's creating a path toward the lighthouse. The other thing that I absolutely love about black and white photography is how you're starting from a picture that is basically lit however it is as you're capturing it in the field, right? So here in the image up top, you basically see my raw image, how I shot it in the daytime, and how you can see the entire pylon of the bridge in that case being lit, as well as all, those strings, or those cables, I should say, coming off of that pile of um, of the bridge. But what I actually decided to do was to create a conversion to black and white so that the light on the pylon and how the background is with respect to the main subject in the picture, I basically reshaped the light entirely in order to create a higher contrast exactly where I wanted the eye of the viewer to fall. So to do that, what I decided to do was to darken the background and increase the contrast, bring in some lights that will be basically shining exactly on the pilot, the bridge. And if I'm pushing this idea even further, you can see how in the picture at the bottom of the slide here that's converted to black and white, I even used it to completely reshape the light and emphasize the volume um, of my particular subject here, which is a really cool building that I shot in France. And you can really look at this approach exactly the same way as what you would do, using any other types of art media. For instance, if you're sketching a sphere, and this is the example that you have here on the top right-hand corner, or if you were painting a sphere or anything like that, you would basically be emphasizing where, the differences between where the light is shining on versus where the shadow is starting, this is going to create a contrast that will bring out the volume inside your picture. And this is kind of a concept that I like to call build volume in your images, because your images, as you're capturing them, they're by definition two-dimensional. But if you're using this trick, you can now really bring out this feeling of three-dimension back into your images. Here's another example of that concept where, again, on the left-hand side, you see essentially the raw picture where it's again shot in the daytime. You can see how the background is pretty bright. The building that was shot in Chicago looks already pretty cool on its own, just like that. But now on the right-hand side, I completely reshaped entirely the light, how it falls on the building, and how it's actually reflecting off the clouds in the background in the sky to really make sure that the building is standing out because of the contrast, and also how the volume also is increased, is emphasized in this picture. And I believe this is the last slide that I have about some of the really cool things that black and white photography allows you to do. And one of those things is really how you can basically turn images that could potentially have been seen 1,000 times into something entirely different. And what I mean by that is that these two images in color, I already started making them a little bit more unique where I shot them, which was in the Palouse. There's this really, really tall butte, essentially this very tall hill that's in the middle of this really gorgeous landscape that you can see in those two images. And all of the photographers who go into this area, they all go up on top of this hill, and they're all going to take basically roughly the same pictures, right? They're all going to be shooting the landscape with how it's creating these really abstract lines. Not the case in these two images, but a lot of what you can also include in those pictures would be houses, silos, because this is a very much, how to say, it's an area where there's a lot of crops going on, being grown there. So there are a lot of silos, grain elevators, and whatnot. But all of those images are very, very similar in shape. Now, if you're actually converting them to black and white, they're turning into these completely different images, such as the ones that you see here, that are purely abstract in this case. So I really decided to step away from reality and create something that was very, very different, even though pretty much every single photographer you can think of who would be visiting this area will have images that will very much look alike. Oh, actually, I just lied. This was not the last one. I do have one more. Um, so talking about stepping away from reality, black and white photography is also a really great way to set the mood in your work, in your images. And you can decide some of your images to convert them to a fairly high key, meaning a fairly bright image. When images are bright, typically they will bring in a sense of zen and quietness. It will be a very, very pleasing sensation, that feeling that people will um, have as they're basically looking at your images. But you can also decide to essentially convert your image to a much darker, much moodier, much more contrasty version of that picture. And if you go very low key, very contrasty, low key meaning very dark, it will bring in this sense of tension and mystery into your images. And what's great about it is that now if you shoot a picture in color, you are the one who will be able to decide which way you're going to go, right? In the digital darkroom, you can decide to convert your color image to create something very bright, very um, quiet, very zen-like, or you can create something like on the right-hand side where the picture is very contrasty. There's a lot of tension um, in your image. And this is really why I say that black and white photography for me is a great way to actually um, bring even more freedom, um, even so, yeah, more freedom in terms of creative options that you may have. And so the question really is, what is going to be your vision? Are you going to decide to capture your pictures and convert it so that it's very bright, so that it's very dark and moody? Um, you're going to be the one deciding that. And in this particular section here, I'm going to show you a couple of things that you need to keep in mind on how you may actually want to approach your images to decide whether you're going to go one way or the other. So here in these two images, you see basically those very colorful, very high color contrast pieces of candy, right? Very famous brand. On the right-hand side, what I did was to just desaturate my color image. And you can see how this is becoming very, very hard to read because everything is kind of very dull. There's not really anything that's standing out in my picture. So typically when you're converting a color image to black and white, you pretty much don't want to just desaturate those images. Um, and you'll see that in this particular slide where just for fun, I decided to create this um, in a way you can think of it as a leading line, right? That would be created in this case with a color contrast of those different little um, bits and pieces of the same color. On the right-hand side, you again have the desaturated image and you're completely losing that color contrast. Again, the picture is very dull, so that's not the way you want to do it. However, if you're converting to black and white in a little bit of a smarter way, using a different tool, you are actually able to get back that uh, information, that quote unquote color contrast, which in this case would be turned into black and white contrast, so that you would be able to recover that information that the desaturation would be completely losing. And that's a really, really great way of actually still, when you're in the field looking for scouting locations and looking for good subjects and good compositional elements, great locations to shoot those subjects from. Still, my recommendation is to look for color contrast because I will show you in the next few slides, you can still use it to make your black and white images even stronger. Okay, so let's go back to, again, a whole bunch of these little guys with one being of a different color in a sea of the same color. Here's, again, the example of just desaturating the colors. The one that has a different color doesn't really come out as I showed you in the last couple of slides and as you would expect. Now, if I'm using those really cool tools that I'm going to mention in the next few slides, you're able to decide basically if the green ones are going to turn into very bright and the one red will be dark, or you could actually do it the other way around. The green ones, sorry, will be very dark, while the red one will be very bright. So again, this is another example of how starting from the exact same color image, you can do any number of black and white conversions that will potentially work really nicely, but you are going to be the ones as the fine art photographer editing in the darkroom, or the darkroom, I should say, the digital darkroom, which way you're going to go. And this is a way to really step away from reality. So the question is, what is going to be your vision? Are you going to pick the picture on the left-hand side, the one on the right-hand side, or are you going to do something a little bit between the two? But at the end of the day, because you're going to be the one deciding this, you're essentially the artist, and you're jumping right into the realm of fine art photography. And in fine art photography, you're really going to be able to do pretty much anything you can think of. I like to say that the color image, I really consider it as being the canvas on which I would be working very much like a painter, deciding whether I'm going to transcribe reality one way or another, or even just go completely different in terms of reality, and create something that is going to be 100% my own and very unique vision of what I'm capturing. So let's talk a little bit about how to create black and white images. Well, back in the day, some of you might actually be very familiar with these. Those are contact sheets from way back when people used to be shooting film. And it was very easy at the time because, you had plain black and white film that you could just load into your camera, and it would come out as black and white, right? Depending on the type of film, you would have different contrasts, different type of grain. And so the idea would be to basically pick the film that you wanted, and then you would be bringing it into the dark room, and you would be using all kinds of different tools, do all kinds of different cool things like dodging, burning certain areas, and that would essentially create, your final image on a print like that. Nowadays, it can be much easier to actually capture images straight to black and white, because some cameras that manufacturers basically offer are using straight black and white sensors. So they would be very similar to a color camera, except that the sensor itself would be um, using a filter on top of it that would be turning essentially your camera to black and white in a way. However, those cameras are not very many, and they tend to be more expensive. So nowadays, what is typical, and this is exactly what I actually personally do as well, is to use a color camera in order to capture your images. And have after you have captured your images, you're able to convert them to black and white, which is going to be the next slide. Color sensors, just one thing to keep in mind is that typically they would be using a type of uh, pixel um, sensor grid that relies on the different colors, RGB, so red, green, and blue, meaning that one pixel is going to be sensitive to one of those three colors, while the next one will be sensitive to another one of those colors. So without going into all the details, black and white sensors versus color sensors, even though they will create potentially the same, or not the same, but images that could end up being similar, they actually really work very differently. However, the color sensors, the color cameras, require to do a conversion to black and white in post. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but this is just to mention that there are many, many, many pieces of software out there that can be used to do color to black and white conversion. The ones that I personally use are Camera Raw, followed by Adobe Photoshop. However, any of the other options that you can find out there are totally fine. You know, when you're editing images in post, there's really 50 different ways, if not more, of doing exactly the same thing. So some of the slides that you'll see later in this presentation, I'm focusing on those tools because those are the ones that I use. But again, this is more as an example of a workflow and not just to say that this is the only way of doing things, because obviously it's not. So just one thing that I also want to kind of bring up and so that you can start thinking about it as well is that when you're capturing an image and you want to look at it on a screen, you need to keep in mind that depending on the screen you're looking at, if that screen is not calibrated, and I'm going to define a little bit better what I mean by calibrated, you will see different rendering of those images. So the file itself is exactly the same. However, because maybe one screen is going to be a little bit brighter than another one, you know, the images will be looking a little bit differently. For instance, between screen number 2 and screen number 3. Or you could have a little bit of a different contrast between screen number 1 and screen number 2. And so where I'm going with this is that it makes it very important to realize this, because the way that you're going to be editing your images, and that is actually also true in color, not just in black and white, will be dependent on what screen you're using, unless you're calibrating that screen. And so this is kind of where I'm explaining what calibrating a screen means. This is an example of what a calibration device looks like. There are, again, multiple out there. And I'm sure that you will be able to find the one that you like best at B&H. But here's the idea. The idea is that you're basically going to use a piece of software that will be showing on the screen a color that, just to make it easier, I will say is green. Obviously, there are many different types of greens, but let's just assume there's one type of green only for this case. So it's going to show green. You will have that device up there on the screen that will actually measure what the monitor is displaying, what type of green is actually rendered on your monitor. It will realize that the green it's expecting is actually different from the one it's actually measuring, right? Because again, the monitor might be a little bit brighter or darker or a little bit more contrasty, whatever the reason. The green measured will be different from the green expected. So what it's going to do is basically apply an adjustment table, a color profile, it's really called, to fix how the green that is measured and what it actually looks like with what it will look like. So now it's going to turn that green over here on the monitor to the green that's on the right-hand side. And it's going to do exactly the same for the blues and for the reds. And doing this will basically make sure that now the screen you're looking your images on will be perfectly calibrated. And if you're going from one screen that's calibrated to another screen that's calibrated, you will see exactly the same image. It will also help when it comes to printing images down the line. So overall, if you had an image that looked like this, you will end up having a picture that actually looks like what it's supposed to look like based on the file, based on the image file itself. Now you have an accurate rendering of the colors and tonalities, which is the best condition that you can um, choose to be in when it comes to editing your images. And again, this is true both in color as well as in black and white. So let's talk a little bit about a typical workflow, typical of my work, which again may be very different from someone else's. So the very first thing that I will do is basically bring in my raw image essentially into Camera Raw, and I will start using those sliders. If you're not familiar with Camera Raw, it's one of these pieces of software that is extremely similar to Lightroom. You might be more familiar with Lightroom and those sliders, and it essentially does pretty much the same thing as Lightroom. You can bring the slider to the left or to the right and change the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, and so on and so forth. Um, I am going to use these to essentially change the overall settings in my image as a whole, not very localized and not in a very precise way yet. However, I will import this particular image in Photoshop. And in that case, so this is what you're seeing here. Now I'm in Photoshop. And over there, I will start basically modifying my images and starting to adjust the different parts of my images independently from one another. And I will show you some examples here. So for instance, here, I decided to adjust the luminosity and the contrast of the sky in the reflection. So this was before, where you can see how everything is kind of dark, and now it's much brighter. But I didn't change anything else with this step. I'm going to do another step where I'm going to change something else. If you see over here in the background, I have this mountain, and I decided to actually remove that mountain in the lower part of the sky. And this is something that I can do in Photoshop that's going to be very, very hard to do in Lightroom. I'm not showing you exactly how I'm doing this in Photoshop, unfortunately, because I don't have enough time during this presentation. If you guys are actually interested in learning more about how I'm doing these things, I have other presentations to do. I also offer one-on-one editing classes. So just get back in touch with me, let me know, or let B&H know that you guys are interested in it. And I'm sure that we're going to be very happy to set up more time to discuss all these different things. So the next thing at that point is that I decided to actually stretch a little bit vertically the mountain. Remember, I'm doing this because I'm a fine art photographer. I'm not a documentary photographer. If I were a documentary photographer, I would not do any of those things pretty much. I would be leaving the mountain the way it looks like. I would be leaving the one mountain also in the back close to the horizon line, exactly how it is. But because I'm a fine art photographer, and again, I'm using my raw image as a canvas to creating something that is essentially in my mind and not necessarily what I'm seeing. I'm using what I'm seeing as, how to say, the base for my final image, but it is going to be, my final image is going to be very different from uh, what I actually see in the field. At that point, the next step is for me that I decided to change a little bit the tonalities in the sky and in the foreground by creating or starting to bring in a vignette. So again, the vignette is when you're darkening the outside of the picture so that you're going to have a brighter area around typically the subject that you want people to focus on. And what I'm going to want people to focus on in this picture will be that mountain here um, in the distance. So I'm starting to darken all the outside of my picture so that essentially it's de-emphasizing the outside of the picture. The next step is for me to actually take this picture in color and now convert it to black and white, because I'm really pretty happy with how it looks in color. And a lot of people typically ask me if I do edit my images in color before I convert to black and white. And my answer is yes. I always edit my image in color before converting it to black and white. And the reason for that is because I want to have basically a solid base upon which I can build my black and white image. I really like saying that this is the same as building a house. You need very solid foundation for your house before you start putting the walls together. In the case of the black and white image, it's exactly the same. I need to have my really solid foundation, which is my color image, before converting it to black and white. And the way that I personally convert to black and white is by using a tool, a plugin that's called Silver Effects. It's actually part of the Nick collection, which I believe now is owned by DxO. It's one of the plugins that's provided in this collection. And the way it works really is that you're basically from Photoshop going to kick your image into Silver Effects. Silver Effects, the window looks like what you're seeing here on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side of that window, you have a number of what they call presets. So the presets are essentially automatic conversions from color to black and white that are using specific settings in terms of brightness, color, contrast, and so on and so forth. And as you can see on the left-hand side, you can get all kinds of different effects. So the way that I will be converting to black and white, or at least that I will start the conversion to black and white, is by picking one of the presets that will be closest to the final image that I envision in my mind my final product will look like. Once I'm picking this particular preset, this particular setting, I will create while using Silver Effects, it will create a layer that will correspond to all these different settings. Then what I'm going to do is go back to my original color image that I just showed you before, this guy right there, and I'm going to bring it into Silver Effects one more time. And now I'm going to pick another preset, or I might pick the exact same preset, but change the sliders slightly so that, for instance, in a different location in the image, say in this case, where the reflections are in this part of the lake, the contrasts look much better. And then I'm going to go back once again to my color image, kick it back again to Silver Effects, change my sliders, pick another setting, preset, whatever I need to do, so that in this case, I like, say, the sky a little bit better, and so on and so forth, right? I'm going to just keep going back to my color image and push it into Silver Effects, create different versions of black and white for the different locations in my image. And finally, I will merge those different locations, different layers, based on the locations that I liked those layers best to create a final black and white image. So for instance, in the very first layer, I might have picked just the mountain over here in my preset number 1. Preset number 2, I picked only this part of the picture where the reflections are located. Preset number 3, maybe I picked up, just the foreground, and so on and so forth. And to do this, I'm using layers and masks. At the end of the day, I will make a few more adjustments. In this case, I increased a little bit more the vignette, but I will basically finish my black and white image at that point. And this is essentially a typical workflow of how I start with the color image and go all the way to my black and white picture. So, Derek, I see we only have 15 minutes. Should we stop now for questions? What do you think?
Thibault, I'll leave it up to you. If you have some some more slides you want to get through, and then we could just knock everything out, and we'll try to
Okay.
consolidate where we can. It looks like we have a couple infrared questions, so I guess we could group those all together. But yeah, if you
Yeah,
want
it
to,
sounds great.
yeah, if you want to wrap it, and then I'll kind of condense the questions for you.
Okay, sounds good.
Perfect.
So, yeah, I basically, these are the last 2 slides of my presentation. I just wanted to mention that I do offer infrared workshops, 1-day workshops in Oregon that are focused on capturing some of the really beautiful waterfalls that we have over here. I don't have dates set up quite yet for those, but I'm also very happy to just, organize one at a date that might work for people. And I do have a couple of workshops that are coming up with some dates in October, where I'm going to be taking people in the Palouse area in Washington State, and another one where I'm going to take people along the really beautiful South Oregon coast. Those 2 workshops, we will extensively talk about long exposure, which is one of my other favorite techniques. Black and white photography as well. There will be a session on editing, and yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you guys have any interest and any questions, just feel free to get in touch with me. And if you're interested in any of my future presentation, feel free to also sign up for my newsletter. And yeah, I'd love to get some questions, in particular on infrared, which is one of my other really uh, favorite techniques.
You love infrared.
Oh, I do.
That's your thing. That's when I think of your work, I
Yes.
think of the infrared. So let's start there, because we did have a
Okay.
couple questions. And for those of you who have not seen Thibault's infrared work, we do have we did an infrared workshop that we'll have to dig out of the archives and see if we can get a link drop to that. But you
Yes.
guys can definitely check that out. But we did have a question regarding if
Mhm.
you're that based on that first image, if you're using 720 nanometer.
So when it comes to shooting infrared, I actually have a camera that is converted to 590, which means that it still has a little bit of color in the visible spectrum, but most of it is just infrared. The reason that I decided to go for 590 and not 720 is because I do like to have that little bit of color, which really helps me quite a bit edit my images faster um, when I'm doing the conversion from the fake infrared color in a way, so to speak, to the black and white. In particular, it really helps bring out the sky and edit the sky differently than the rest of the picture. So I do recommend personally to use a little bit of color, although 720 is going to be a more straightforward way of editing if you don't want necessarily to um, edit the different parts of your images independently from one another.
Okay. Now we got that out of the way where some people were like, wait, some of these look like they're infrared. Are they infrared? So
Yes,
we've
yes.
deduced, we know you love your infrared. Now I have a follow-up on that. How do you decide between shooting an infrared and taking a normal color image and converting it to black and white? Is there a method to the madness?
Well, I would say it really depends on what you want the final effect to be and what subjects you have in your picture. Typically, if there's no vegetation or if there's no body of water in the picture, um, or if there's no contrast in the sky at all, if it's pure blue sky, it for the most part doesn't really matter if you're shooting black and white or infrared, but infrared is very, very useful when there is a little bit of contrast in the sky, but you want to emphasize that contrast. That will definitely help. It will also help if you're shooting, say, around midday or when light is really harsh. It will also bring out this really cool, very weird effect when you have vegetation in your images. It will also help create this, how to say, very dark contrast when you're shooting water, which is very different. It's pretty much the opposite of the effect that you would get with the long exposure. Long exposure, just like you can see in this image here at the bottom right-hand corner, turns the water pretty bright. In infrared, the water would be very dark because it tends to really absorb infrared light. Um, so any of these different situations, I would say, make for really great infrared images.
Now, we had some questions regarding if there's any use of filters or what do you use for your post processing. So if you can talk a little bit about the gear as far as hardware and software that you're
Sure.
using, both in taking the images and then what are you a fan of as far as your post processing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to gear in terms of hardware, pretty much all the long exposure images that you're seeing were shot in the daytime. Like I think 99% of them were shot in the daytime, which means that to be able to achieve those really, really slow shutter speeds, you have to be using neutral density filters. There are a few really good manufacturers out there. Breakthrough Photography is one of them. Lee Filters is one of them. Format High Tech and Nisia is also a pretty good one. So any of those would be good picks. For long exposure, the other thing that is absolutely mandatory is going to be a really stable um, foundation for your setup to be resting on, meaning typically it's going to be a tripod. So a very, very sturdy tripod is highly recommended. Um, for the long exposures, you will also need to basically use your camera in a bulb setting, which means that pretty much you're going to have to be using a shutter trigger of some sorts. The ones that I really like are the Velo. Um, they're really good and pretty straightforward to use. And I would say that's really about it when it comes to the gear. You know, like almost any camera nowadays, as long as it has a bulb setting, will allow you to shoot long exposures and then to convert to black and white. So now that brings me to the black and white conversion. So typically, the pieces of software that I will use will be Camera Raw, because I shoot Sony, and so to bring in my images into Photoshop, I basically go through DNG converter and then Camera Raw. Um, and after that, like I mentioned, I do pretty much everything in Photoshop, although I do use a number of plugins, most of them being from Nick. And I would use color effects from time to time, but for black and white conversion, I will almost exclusively use silver effects. Some of the other plugins that I have used in the past and might use on specific occasions when, for instance, I need to print really, really big, but for some reason it's an older um, file shot on an older camera and I don't necessarily have all the resolution that I wish I did. I would use, I think it's Topaz Gigapixel that is pretty good at upsizing images. And I think that's about it when it comes to software. Did I cover all the questions
I think
or did I miss something?
no, I think so. I think you nailed it there.
Okay, good.
Tom, who's joined us on Vimeo, is asking if you
Mhm.
prefer starting with a high contrast scene for the color image, such as if you're taking a photo in the middle of a sunny day. Is there any tips that you
Sure.
have for settings, or whether it's underexposing, exposing for highlights, anything that
Mhm.
you take into consideration when you're going to convert something or know that you're going to convert something to black and white?
Right. So that's actually a really, really good question. Um, I would say that typically I will try to build the picture, excuse me, as in I will create the final image already converted to black and white in my mind as I'm actually scouting the location and even before I'm picking my camera and setting up my equipment. So because I have the idea of what I want my final image to look like, I know whether my final image is going to be, say, high key or low key or very contrasted or anything like that, which means that now I'm going to set up and capture my image to match what I want my final picture to look like. So for instance, if my final image is intended to be high key, I will definitely shoot to the right of the histogram, right? I will try to have a very bright image and not necessarily very high contrast. If I know that I will want a very contrasty image, I will probably try to shoot a little with my histogram a little bit more to the left. That being said, just generally speaking, I tend to favor having the widest dynamic range that you can from your camera, because if you have the widest dynamic range and captured, then you still have the option to go the other way around in case you change your mind during the po in post, because you might have an idea in the field, and when you're looking at the picture on the big screen, you realize that something happened and it's not going to work the way you were anticipating it would. And so you may need to change gears at that point. So wide dynamic range, meaning the histogram as wide as possible, is, I would say, um, the desirable, the most desirable option that I would recommend at that point. That being said, just to go back to a small piece of the question, typically if I can, I will try to avoid shooting in very harsh light conditions. Typically, during midday light conditions, if I can, I will try to avoid that. If I cannot avoid that because, say, I'm visiting Iceland and I'm not going to be I'm not going to be able to stay there for very long. I will still shoot it, but that's one of those times that I might actually shoot using my infrared camera because it will help me with the harsh lights.
Okay. Now, our final question here, Thibault.
Mhm.
One of the great things about shooting with mirrorless cameras is that you can shoot in black and white in real
Yes.
time and you can see in black and white. Is that something that you ever utilize or no?
I don't, because typically when you're setting it up to black and white, you will see pretty much the equivalent of the desaturated image that I showed you some examples of earlier. And these can really mislead you. Whereas if you're looking at the color picture, with enough experience, how you can use the color contrast to your advantage, and how you can actually create better black and white images than what you would actually see by setting up your camera to black and white mode. That being said, keep in mind also that as long as you're shooting in RAW, even if visually you're seeing the picture in black and white, the raw image is actually in color. So you can always go back to the color picture and then do a conversion that's going to be different than a desaturated uh, from, conversion. But just because it tends to mislead me when I see the picture in black and white straight on my camera, I actually don't do it.
Interesting. Okay. I know everybody has their different take on it. So I wanted to
Mhm.
hear yours because I know you're big into the black and white. And I should have known that this was gonna that the infrared was gonna sneak in here
Mhm.
somewhere along the line. But Thibault, want to thank you again. It's always great to have you on.
Of course.
This is such an area of expertise for you. Beautiful images, and you
Thank you.
you take some of the most difficult concepts with this stuff and make it super easy to understand. So, want to thank you for your approach to everything, and of course, a huge thank you to Sony for hosting today's event. And
Yes.
all of our viewers out there, no matter which platform you're joining us from, we did drop a link to Thibault's previous workshop on infrared photography into the comments section. So
Great.
if that is something that's of interest to you guys, definitely go ahead and check that out. And remember to stay tuned for everything that we have going on here at the B&H Event Space. You can check us out on YouTube once again. Just look up B&H Event Space. But that's all we got for now. Huge thank you to Thibault, Sony, and to all of you out there watching. Another rendition of the B&H Virtual Event Space is in the books. We'll catch y'all next time.